Okay, here we go. Hello, buenas tardes. Welcome. Good evening. I am Judith Hill, the president of San Miguel Penn Center. And we are so glad that you are here with us today. And we are ecstatic to be offering our 2022 Zoom and sometime soon, we hope, live San Miguel Presents with these extraordinary authors that we've brought to you today. And we are grateful for this miracle of technology granting us the delicious possibility of cross-cultural, cross-borders community without leaving our homes. This is an eco-global event with a low-carbon footprint. We are running on the energy of the voice, commitment, and the internet. Today, we've invited two phenomenal authors, really superstars, cultural change makers, and wisdom women to come and share some of their wealth of knowledge and their insights in a very juicy conversation. So, wherever and whenever it may be for you, we invite you sit back, relax, and as you listen, please go to the bottom of your screen if you have any questions and you see that little Q&A box. Put your questions for Roxanne or Sandra there, and we thank you so much for joining us today. Here we go. It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome our honored guests. Sandra Cisneros, groundbreaking writer and poet, is the acclaimed author of over 11 books. Her novel, The House on Mango Street, has sold more than 2 million copies. Cisneros has received numerous awards for her work, including the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship and the National Medal of Arts. Some of her best-known books include Martita, I Remember You, which I think is her latest, published last September, Woman, Hollering Creek, and Other Stories, which I adore, Loose Woman Poems, A House of My Own, Stories from My Life, and great news for all of us, a collection of Sandra's poetry, a new collection, Woman Without Shame, is forthcoming this September. And we are so privileged to have tonight, in addition to our beloved Sandra, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Roxanne grew up in rural central Oklahoma, the child of a tenant farmer family. She received a BA in history at San Francisco State College and her master's and PhD in history at the University of California, Los Angeles, and an MFA in creative writing at Mills College, and a diploma in international and comparative law of human rights in Strasbourg, France. As a veteran of the 60s revolution, listen to this, you guys, it's really impressive. Roxanne organized against the U.S. war in Vietnam, U.S. imperialism, racism, South African apartheid, workers' rights, women's liberation, and restoration of Native American nations' rights and sovereignty. Roxanne helped build the indigenous people's participation in the United Nations. She received the 2015 American Book Award and the 2017 Lannan Cultural Freedom Prize. A historian, writer, and professor emeritus at California State University, she's the author or editor of 15 books, including Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, and the very famous An Indigenous People's History of the United States, Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, and her latest, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settlers' Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. Roxanne is at work on a book of essays on Christian nationalism in the U.S. that will be published in 2023. And now, it is our honor and delight to say, welcome, Roxanne, welcome, Sandra.
Thank you, Judith, for that lovely intro. And maybe viewers don't realize this, but I am meeting Roxanne live because we really do not know each other except an email or two. Isn't that right, Roxanne? And I think you wrote to me because I had mentioned your book in article, an interview that I did. And the book I'd mentioned was this one, Loaded, about the disarming history of the Second Amendment, or in other words, about how guns have proliferated and taken over our society in the United States. It's really a phenomenal book. But the book that I actually knew about first, Roxanne, and I'll tell you why, is this one, the one that won the American Book Award, an Indigenous People's History of the United States. And I bought this for several people, including young people that are related to me. I hope that they're watching. And I just wanted to follow up before we got on the air. We were talking a little bit about your lineage and how you came about to be writing about the subjects you're writing about, because your books are a trajectory, it looks like, beginning with the first book of the Sioux Nation and going on. You have 7 books, if I'm correct, that bring us all to date to the book we're going to discuss today about Not a Nation of Immigrants. So I want to talk a little bit about, your background. Can you continue or start from the beginning and tell the audience what you were telling me before the camera started rolling?
Thank you, Sandra, and thanks to Judith and thanks to Penn San Miguel Dande for inviting me. I feel quite honored. Yeah, I had a very rural background, raised in rural Oklahoma. I was raised a very devout Southern Baptist. So my next book of essays is going to be part talking about that and leaving it, and some insights from my first 20 years of my life experience about Christian nationalism, which is white nationalism today. And yeah, so I left Oklahoma as pretty much as quickly as I could. I got married at 18, and then my husband and I moved to San Francisco to find the beatniks. And I still live in San Francisco, although I've lived many other places, including Europe, but all over the country and traveled everywhere. But I always seem to be coming back to San Francisco. It's kind of the home base, a very safe place to be in this rather unsafe country.
And the funny thing that's interesting is that we were talking about Texas, because I lived in San Antonio, Texas, even though I was born in Chicago. I ran away from Chicago. I was older than you, 28, when I could afford to run away, and wound up in San Antonio, Texas. And you said that's where you were born.
I was actually born.
Yeah, right?
I was born, and unfortunately just lived, they took me back to Oklahoma when I was 6 months old, but I was always told about it. They sang San Antonio Rose to me, the country Western song. And I had many relatives there. I didn't visit it until we went on a family trip, our one and only family trip, I think, ever, to San Antonio when I was 12. I thought it was a really, they took me out to where I was born. It was like this sort of tin shack in this what's now very, was then kind of an industrial area, but it must have been kind of rural then. But I'd heard so much about the Alamo, that you were born near the Alamo. And I expected it to be this big castle, this little tiny, a little dinky thing, I was so disappointed. Of course, later when I learned, the whole story, I realized that it, what happened at the Alamo is that the Mexicans won, but we were never taught that.
Maybe that's the seed, because you talk so much about history, who's telling the story and how it shapes. Yeah. And I lived in a town that I couldn't understand how that little Alamo could be told by the Daughters of the Republic of Texas and create a colonial community of
Yeah.
Mexican Americans. It was just so bizarre. That story is the story that artists try to appropriate and retell and revise. So
Right.
maybe that's the seed for you in coming
Yeah.
into the career that you have found.
Yeah, I think so. My dad was a storyteller. He told stories, and I've checked a lot of them out, stories about the family, about his father, and many things, about the Depression and the socialist movement in Oklahoma that his father was involved in. And I was an asthmatic, a sickly child, and I missed a lot of school. And he told me stories, and it would really quiet me down, because if I got agitated at all and scared, I would have it can really kill you, an asthma attack.
Mhm.
And because my older brothers and sisters, he never told them stories, but I think his telling the stories, he was so good at it. I think he could have been a very good writer, but of course he only went to the 8th grade, and he wouldn't even have thought of that. My mother also was a writer. I mean, she also went to the 8th grade, but she wrote a column for a town nearby, 9 miles away, about our little community in Piedmont, Oklahoma. And she sat there writing all the time. So I had, a little model. We didn't really have any books. The school library had many fewer books than I have in my apartment right now. Many fewer.
Now, but you became a historian coming from this house with no book and that's my next question. Like, how do you become a historian? What is a historian? And how do you get a socialist father from Texas to Oklahoma? I don't get it.
Yeah. He was from that family, the Dunbars. They're Scots-Irish from Appalachia. And that's a whole part of my book, a whole chapter on that. It's not a good story. It's kind of the symbol of settler colonialism in the United States. So that family, the Dunbar family, then they were in Kentucky, the Appalachian part of Kentucky. Then they went to Missouri, kind of following Daniel Boone's path. He went to Missouri when it was still Spanish territory, and then the United States took it with the Louisiana Purchase. And then they were in Missouri for a long time. And then when Oklahoma opened for settlement, a lot of people came from Missouri. They didn't go in the land rush. They went in 1907. My father was born that year in Oklahoma. So his dad was a veterinarian, trained veterinarian, also had land and a few cattle. And they were a fairly prosperous family, as comparatively, not wealthy, but he lost everything when he became a socialist. He was also in the Industrial Workers of the World. And he named my father after the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World. So I think this is what made a radical out of me, because I would ask my dad over and over, tell me about the people in your name again, Moyer, Haywood, Scarberry, Pettibone, Dunbar. So he'd tell about each one. They were on trial in Boise City for murder that they didn't do, and Clarence Darrow. So I think he made me a historian. I learned a lot of history just through his oral stories, and probably stories he'd heard from his father and older brothers.
That is amazing, because you tell all this story of the United States and the Scot-Irish in your book, and you explain a lot of things, and now it's making sense because it's your family.
Yeah, it's very interesting. that, and there were a lot of Scots-Irish. I would say probably 80% of the white Protestants in Oklahoma were, when I was growing up, were Scots-Irish background, because they came out of Appalachia. They're everywhere, all over the country. They then migrated to Dust Bowl, and Washington, Oregon, Wyoming. They're a troubling group, but I think I was lucky to have my father, who had this experience with socialism, because I was given other alternatives besides being a bigot and a bully and a pioneer.
Wow. I'm going to read something from your book, and maybe later come back to the idea of reading the Sherman Alexie poem. But you said the United States has never been a nation of immigrants. It's in the title, not a nation of immigrants. Settler colonialism, white supremacy, and a history of erasure and exclusion. And you're saying it's always been a settler state. But what is, for someone who's a young person who's watching this, can you define a settler colonial versus an immigrant? Like, what's the difference?
Yeah, and settler colonials, one form of colonialism. It's actually the minority form, because India, most of Africa, Southern Africa has areas of a settler colonialism. In South Africa, in Zimbabwe, Namibia, but it's basically was an Anglo settler colonialism they did in Northern Ireland. They had already colonized Ireland for 2 centuries, and then they decided to make the north of Ireland to move the peasants, the Irish peasants, off their small land holdings and bring in Scots and make the land free and available to Scots and Welsh and some British, some English. But it was mainly Scots. So the Scots-Irish are actually the Protestants today who are reactionary and have persecuted the Irish Catholics for centuries. And I call them trekkers, kind of professional trekkers. They went on to Australia, New Zealand, to the 13 colonies, to Appalachia. So they're, in all of these places. So Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the United States are the prototype settler colonial states. It means basically eliminating the native, simply pushing them out, killing them, just taking them off the land, taking their land and bringing settlers in. So most colonialisms are export of resources to the home country for industry, and very, very profitable. But this Anglo-colonialism, which it was in Ireland, was more agricultural, and of course, in the 13 colonies, plantation slavery. And this was in the Caribbean, slavery was like 90% of the population was Black slaves, African slaves, and a tiny population. So that's a difference between colonialism. And in Africa, mainly it was administrative colonialism. And in Asia, the French had settler colonialism in Algeria. They never came to outnumber. The French settlers never came to the Pied Noir. They never came out to outnumber the indigenous Algerians. In Vietnam, they also had pockets of settler colonialism, but they didn't ever outnumber. So it's only in those Anglo colonies where they, if you can call it success, succeeded in eliminating the indigenous peoples and their hold on the land and putting them into well, in South Africa, they're called Bantustans, the reservation system. But that system was put in place in 1948, the apartheid system, and it copies. Israel is a settler colonial state. And both Israel and the apartheid regime in South Africa copied the US model. So
Okay,
did
my question now is, why weren't the Pilgrims immigrants?
because they were settlers. They came to take the land and own it. And the difference is really the definition of settler is someone who comes from another place to stay. And an immigrant is someone who comes to a place that they then become a part of an existing polity. They didn't make it. Settlers make their state. Immigrants join an already, they may come to have some influence, but they rarely take over.
To perpetuate it, though.
It's perpetuated, yeah. The settler colonialism is perpetuated, and it was only in 1880s that the first immigration law was passed, and that was to exclude Chinese.
Right, I know that because I did all this research for my novel Caramelo, and I even have a graph in the back of my book with all of the years because I wanted to write about immigration. That brings me to, you open your book with Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda's very popular play.
Right.
And can you talk about that?
Yeah, Ishmael Reed and I, the poet, wonderful poet and writer, Ishmael Reed, I don't know if you know, he took on Hamilton with, and I was in the small circle of people who hated the music. I mean, okay, the music was powerful and good, but the story that was taken, that people have taken seriously, as real history, was just the opposite of what it is. First of all, Hamilton was, he's called an immigrant, and there's a line that says immigrants, he and the royal from France, Lafayette, are riding on a horse, and they say, immigrants get things done. He and Hamilton, neither were immigrants. The royal from France, of course, went back, and after the revolution had no intention of staying. He's 19 years old. He just wanted to fight. And Hamilton came from a British colony. It was like going from Oklahoma to California, moving to Oklahoma to California, to move from St. Nevis in the Caribbean to go to university at Columbia in New York. So, and he did that before independence. It was a colonial system. So that definition of an immigrant, and I think it gave a false promise to immigrants who were treated very badly in the United States. And it gave them a script, a mythology that could seem to empower them, but it's a lie. And it covers up settler colonialism, it erases it. Not only do you not see enslaved people, even though they blackface themselves, or they're black actors playing Hamilton and Washington and all, but they're no native people. It's already, they're not there. And of course, this is like 1776, when it was densely populated. They were fighting, the main people they were fighting were Indians and not the British.
Okay. When have you talked to Lin-Manuel?
No.
Did he ever write to Ishmael Reed, or have they?
No, I don't know. Ishmael, I think he had some kind of interaction. He wrote a play, and it was an off-Broadway one-act play, and I have the book, and I quote a lot from it, but he saw it, what he was seeing is Lin-Manuel trying to make himself into an immigrant. And Puerto Rico is a colony. He's from a colony. So it's a sort of, a flattening. It's a kind of the prototype of what, it's actually what made me decide to write that book. When Hamilton the play came out is when I decided to write that book, because I had published, on a blog back in blog days before social media. I had a rant, I kind of call it a rant, saying, stop calling this a nation of immigrants, and then telling about settler colonialism. And it kind of went viral, as things did then. It got around and, people were exchanging it. And my editor at Beacon Press said, why don't you expand that, write that into a book? And I didn't really think about it until the Hamilton thing. And I said, now I've got to write this because, so
That's how that happened.
That's how
And
that
thankfully, you were locked down, so you had nothing to do, and you can write that book.
yes.
Okay, I have to say, for writers, lockdown was a godsend. We were very lucky that we had time. We could cancel
Yeah.
all public speaking and stop being the author and become a
Exactly.
writer. So for writers, it was time to finish books. I finished 2 myself.
Yeah.
So I have a question then, because you write so much in both your books, the history of the indigenous people's history of the United States, which, by the way, I learned so much. And then in this subsequent book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, I learned so much about the history of the Americas and about myself and about the stories that we've been told and the true stories. One of the things that woke me up was I have a block down the street here from where I live in the Parroquia de San Juan de Dios. There used to be a little metal plaque before someone stole it that said, this is the Camino Real. I thought, wow, the Camino Real. And then I found out from reading your book that the Camino Real wasn't created by the Spanish crown. It was co-opted by the Spanish crown from trade routes that the native communities did from Canada all the way down to what is now Tierra del Fuego, that these routes existed, that there's and trade that was created from communities coast to coast, up and down. It wasn't this just like, nobody's here, you might as well move in and create something. It was just co-opted by the empires. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. The mythology is that the native people were just kind of few and wandering around, and that they weren't really attached to the land. And they were actually the first agrarian civilization in the world. Was the Incas, and then in central Mexico, and in the eastern part of the United States were 3 of the 7 founding agricultural areas of the world. Corn is the sacred to all of the native people in North America, and it comes out of Mesoamerica, out of Central America, and the stories that people tell, Cherokees and Creeks, tell about those migrations. And some, I know, when I was married to Simon Ortiz, he's from Acoma Pueblo, they had some stories of actually coming all the way from Peru to North America. So there were roads everywhere. And what the colonists did, North America, and the Spanish too, they simply appropriated all that infrastructure. They tore down the beautiful city of Tenochtitlan, and built on top of it. But they took all of the roads, all the industry that existed, all of the land, the productive land, turned it into commercial crops rather than food. And they could never have survived without all that infrastructure. It would have been impossible.
And I have,
and
what about the Aztecs who were originally up in the
yes,
what is now the southwest of the USA,
right,
and their language is the same as the central region as the Hopi, the Nahuatl-based language. So when they moved down, were they settlers or were they immigrants?
well, they were, I don't consider them settlers. There was, there was a lot of motion of people moving. People think indigenous people mean they're like stuck in one place for 20,000 years. But, the populations moved. There were probably voyages back and forth from South America to the Polynesian and Micronesian. There's I say follow the corn, in that book that evolved, because it's even been found, ancient corn, in the Amazon, and all the way up to the subarctic. It spread everywhere, but it came originally out of Mexico. It's just, it's really an incredible story that so-called scientists have refused. They have this frozen Bering Strait theory of one migration all the way from the Arctic to the subarctic. Does that even make sense? I mean, it's not, in no other place in the world is there only a vertical migration. Everyone else is going back and forth in all directions, but not here. So it's even a false ancient history, not just a settler colonial history.
Well, I'm an example of that. I'm a reverse migrant. And I asked myself after reading your book, am I a colonizer or a settler? Because I live in a colonial town that has all this beautiful architecture and wealth that was built on the slave labor of indigenous people and African slaves. And I couldn't live in a more colonial and town, because it's so divided between the Native community and the what I call the immigrant community from other nations in the world. And I try my best to deconstruct that apartheid society we have in San Miguel. And but here we are speaking in English. Here we are, and and I'm a part of that too. So your book makes me think about a lot of things. It makes me think about the Columbus statue that we have over in front of one of the cathedrals here, which I've always wanted to blow up, and Fray Juan San Miguel that's next to the church that has an indigenous man kneeling, looking like he's giving a sexual favor to the priest. It's a horrible statue. Everybody takes their picture next to it. And I can't blow it up, but in a poem, I can destroy it. So I would write a poem about those statues and bring them down. However, like you say in your book, it has to be the community themselves have to rise up and organize to make that change happen. Now, I want to come back to your title. Can you talk a little bit about the myth of nation of immigrants? Where does that come from?
Well, it was a surprise to me, because I was opposing it so vociferously that I didn't know the origin of it. I thought it had just always been around. And when I decided to write the book and I started researching, I found that it was invented fairly recently in 1958 by none other than John F. Kennedy, who was a senator from Massachusetts at that time, preparing to run for president. And he was a child of Irish immigrants, very rich Irish immigrants, but nevertheless, he never before had a president been elected who, for one thing, was Catholic, but the other thing was not a descendant of the original settlers. They're either Anglo or Scots-Irish. I even consider Obama Scots-Irish, because that's his father's family. I mean, his mother's family, and he acted more like a settler than an immigrant. Um, but John F. Kennedy was definitely from the Irish Catholic community, and so he wrote this little book. He was, I guess he was the real author of the books he wrote. He wrote several books before he became president. And he wrote this little book called A Nation of Immigrants. And small, it's never been out of print. It's gone through all kinds of different editions and formats and publishers. If you go on Amazon, you'll see page after page after page of different publication dates, different introductions or afterwards or explanation. And I was so surprised. I said, well, that's very interesting, that he's trying to become a settler he creates a myth in there that actually is bigger. Well, he didn't create it. It's an old Irish myth. And I have that whole chapter on Columbus, which is about, everyone wanting to have discovered the Americas, except the indigenous people themselves. And so there's an Irish myth that the Native people who live in the Western Hemisphere, in modern times, were not the Aboriginals, as Kennedy puts it in that book, because these were people who had come and actually killed all of the real Aboriginal people, who were very likely from Ireland. So that's an Irish myth, that they were actually the first discoverers of.
History's all about who's telling the stories, it looks like.
Yeah, it looks
right?
like.
That reminds me of Guillermo Gomez Peña, the performance artist and Mexican border brujo, as he calls himself, the border brujo. He, on the celebration of Columbus Day, when they did that big deal in Spain, he and his girlfriend dressed as indigenous people, and they put themselves in a cage and they painted.
Yes, I remember.
Please do not discover us.
Yes, that was great. I saw photographs of that. That was amazing.
I always remember that. Please do not discover us. I'll paint it on them,
Yeah.
I don't know how the public received them, but I thought it was a great idea.
Yeah.
Great idea. You have a whole chapter about the Americanization of Columbus and the adoption and the reasons why we name towns and why people claim it. It's really fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah. I want to leave time for questions, but a question that I want to ask you is, what's the real American dream for you?
Well,
I like that you have to think about it.
Yeah, I don't really have, I think being, not being an immigrant, I feel very humble about dissing, people who have American dreams, but I do think it's greatly overrated, that I think most migrants come from, places basically that the US or Western Europe have really destroyed, like the Central American they're not immigrants, they're refugees, but of course they feel better off and they sigh of relief. They can raise their children where they're not so desperately poor. They're desperately poor, but not as desperately poor. And the violence, the gangs that really were fomented by the Reagan administration to keep those revolutions from happening, those democratic revolutions in Central America. And so that, can say that about Africa, the people who go to England, that there's still a kind of, a lingering colonialism. It hasn't been wiped out. And that long period of suppressing all the non-European people of the world is, the United States became the bearer of that burden, if you will, or that leadership. And so it's a beacon because it's the richest country in the world. And it also has a mythology. I remember the first place I ever visited in Asia was Sri Lanka, which was in 1978 considered one of the wealthiest parts of Asia. And I didn't know that at the time. A UN economist told me that later. I couldn't believe it because all I saw were thousands of beggars, thousands, the airport, in the city, in the hotel we stayed. This was an online conference meeting. So it was almost all people from Africa and Asia and all. I was the only US person there, I think, in the whole island, because it's, British go there, but not very many US people went to Sri Lanka. It's a beautiful place. So the word got around that there's an American in the hotel. And I opened my door the first morning from my hotel room, and the entire, it was an old British colonial hotel. The hallways were so wide. It was packed with people sitting there and requesting money.
We're going to run out of time, but I wanted to mention that we're not going to get to hear the part I wanted you to read, which was about the massacre in El Paso. But I just want to tell the viewers that there's so many parts of this book I wish we could share. But I was so taken with how people don't know their history, especially Texas history. That young man who killed all those people in El Paso, who went to the I can't remember what store, Kmart or whatever it was, Target, and he just shot his way there because he felt in his manifesto that the Mexicans were taking over Texas without knowing the history. And so there's a classic example about the myth that US history creates about all of the colonial expansion, and especially about the Mexico-US border. I wanted to talk more about that, but I want to leave time for questions. And I wanted to mention also the war refugees in the Ukraine and how that's connected to the war refugees in Central America, war refugees from Mexico that came up. There's so much to talk about, but I'm going to have to draw close so that other people can ask you questions.
Yes.
So you have questions out there, my lovely viewers who organize themselves to watch, and I'm really anxious to hear what you all have to say.
I do have a few questions. I would myself love to hear your take on the current immigration situation and the Ukrainian immigration situation with what's going on at the border. But one of the questions we have, San Miguel Pen is very, very, very closely involved with the fate of Nicaragua. And we're aware that you visited there over 100 times in the 80s, I believe. And Ortega has now basically declared Nicaragua Pen to be a foreign agent and outlawed them. And he's just throwing journalists and writers in jail. And Gioconda Belli is in exile now in Spain. So I'm just sort of wondering, we have this question, what is your current thinking about what's going on in Nicaragua?
Well, I haven't visited, but I do have, many friends there, and some are US people. It's the seat of Villa Campesina. When the Sandinistas were in power in the 1980s. they started an international organization called Via Campesina, which is huge now. I think actually the most members are from Korea, but the world headquarters is still in Nicaragua. And so there, I know a lot of the Via Campesino people who work there, who are from the United States or Europe or, you know, different places, even though I haven't been, I mean, I knew people back then, but also a whole different generation now that have gone there. So Niels McCune, who's my main friend, Via Campesina, married a Nicaraguan woman, militant. And they're out in a rural area. The peasants are very well organized. So I go by what Sandino said, only the peasants and the workers will remain to the end. The peasants vote overwhelmingly for the FSLN still. And it's the only country in Central America. It's actually the poorest country in the hemisphere by, you know, income and so forth. But it's also food. It has food sovereignty. It feeds its own people, and there is no one without food. Raised as a very poor person, rural person, these things mean a lot to me. And so I do think that people who stay in power too long, remember Angela Merkel was in power longer than Daniel Ortega has been, and no one says, you know, she is a dictator. So
Museveni.
and actually legal elections have been held. So I think there are terrible sanctions on Nicaragua. A lot of damage was done with the U.S. The NED funded uprising in 2018, and so it did a lot of damage, structural damage. They were blowing up bridges. They were tearing down things. So it's difficult, and really attacked the university. So my friend Brian's last name. This is my name, but he's the Vietnam vet whose legs were cut off when he was by the railroad tracks when he was protesting arms going to El Salvador. He has taken Nicaraguan citizenship, and so I hear reports from him. So I like I say, I haven't been there to see for myself, but I do question also some of the people who I used to know, who are Sandinistas, meeting with those horrible Cuban Americans in Florida, and working closely with NED, which is a CIA operation. So there's another side to the stories you're hearing.
Yeah. It's always great to hear. And that's really the heart of your work as a historian, is to show us these sides that we don't hear and that we don't know. So we have another question here. It says, J.D. Vance is trying to become a senator from Ohio.
Yeah.
By heating up the racist anger about the border once again. What can we do to stop this kind of lie?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I have a whole section in this book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, on J.D. Vance.
Woo!
So do read the book. You'll find out what I think of him. I think he's a very dangerous person. I hope he loses. He's gotten the nod from Trump, apparently, and his book was for one thing, a scold, and actually really preaching to Appalachian people that they, need to buck up and improve their lot. At the same time, he's extolling, the Scots-Irish. He's Scots-Irish, like my family. So I have the absolute right to criticize these reactionary people, Scots-Irish. So I think he's a very dangerous person. I hope I know there are about 20 candidates. So I hope he doesn't win, but Trump, on the scale is with the Republicans, gives him a good chance. But he's a smart and, evil is a loaded word, but dangerous, a dangerous kind of figure because he's smarter than most people. He's Harvard educated and playing like he's, a poor little Appalachian boy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if anyone is listening from Ohio, please don't vote for.
Well, the next question that I have for you is your Indigenous Peoples History book used a lot in university classes, and is it used in the lower grades at all?
Oh, thanks for that question. Actually, it was adapted to a young people's edition by Debbie Reese, who's from Nembe Pueblo, and Jean Mendoza. And that came out in 2019. But before that, even the book was being used. I even met people. I have traveled constantly until March 13, 2020, when San Francisco shut down. I traveled 4 or 5 times a month on invitations to speak at various institutions, mostly universities, but also some private schools and community centers, churches, Unitary. My publisher is owned by the Unitarian Church, so Unitarians, and so I really was surprised how many teachers, well, first of all, librarians were really talking up the book, and librarians are very important people. I think I would be better off if only librarians could get elected to political office, run the country as they run libraries. But teachers, that they were using the book in Edmond, Oklahoma, not far from where I grew up. I was so shocked that a middle school teacher in public school in Edmond, Oklahoma, it's not the most progressive state in the country, was using the adult version, because the other one had not come out yet, in her middle school.
It's great.
I said, oh my God, I so surprised. Now in New Mexico, the Central New Mexico School District, I guess they have 20,000 teachers because they bought 20,000 copies of the adult book for the teachers to read in order to develop course plan, curriculum around it. So those are the things I know about, but the book has sold, I don't even know how many printings now. Last I heard, I think it was 9 printings, but it sold out the first printing in the first week, which is totally mysterious to me, how that happened and why it happened. Why? It's just, you cannot predict how a book, its the timing, because when you start writing it, you have no idea what's going to be happening. For me, that book took 5 years. And in 2014, when it was published, I would never have predicted that Donald Trump would be president 2 years later. So it has hit a chord, and it's got around to a lot of places. Yeah.
This is we have a guest, Juan Ramirez, who's asked some really interesting questions that you're going to want to hear. His first is what impact did the casta system have on solidifying white supremacy in the Spanish colonies, and did other European settler colonial enterprises also set up hierarchies?
Yeah, I have a whole section in this book also on the caste
In Not an
system.
Immigrant, is that the book you're referring
Yeah.
to? Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I think it's the first chapter, the second chapter, first chapter. It's sort of a prelude to anything doing with the Americas, because the caste system, originated in Spain with Castile and Aragon merging the royalties of those two provinces, which were northern provinces of blue-eyed blonde people, more like French people. And they did a settler colonialism over a period of 5 centuries, pushing down the Moors, the Muslims, who were farmers who built all the beautiful buildings that are not churches, Christian churches, were Muslim architecture, which is then brought to the Americas, the Muslim architecture all over New Mexico, other places, with the, built around the center, open center, with no windows on the outside. That's the prototype. And that's how the pueblos were built on their own, so it's really interesting.
That's amazing. That's so amazing to know.
Yeah, the architecture of New Mexico is a subject in itself that's very interesting. But they invented a caste system for Spain, at the bottom of which were the Muslims, who were Africans after all. And Spain is practically in Africa. It's a little puddle between Morocco and Spain. So they created something called the cleanliness of blood, limpieza de sangre, and this was their built in. Then it wasn't a state. These were, at that time, before the Protestant Reformation and the founding of states, they were colonies of the Holy Roman Empire. So the head of all of Europe was the Pope, and so these papal bulls came out. Spain was, though, this process going on in Spain of taking Spain was the center of the Holy Roman Empire's program, to expand Christianity. And so they created the cleanliness of blood to test whether the conversos, that is, those Muslims and Jews, were forced to convert when they were conquered. And mind you, this went on over 5-6 centuries before they got to Granada in 1492. And they had a list. At the very bottom was African, and then on up Muslims. So it was simpler. But when it was transported, well, in 1492, they deported all of the Muslims and Jews who became Sephardi to Northern Africa. The populations of Northern Africa are mainly, from this, the deportations, and they took over. And then at that same time, they were deporting, loading on ships, the Jews and Muslims. Columbus goes by with his ships going to ending up in the Americas. So the Spanish take that limpieza de sangre, the cleanliness of blood, with them, and that's the origin of the castas, the caste system. in Mexico. And because that was a prototype of European colonialism, all the others who got in later, the Dutch came pretty quickly, the British, they adopted that and the doctrine of discovery, which was the papal bull, that they own any land they touched, Christian, that was non-Christian, they could enslave. And all Portugal, with all of Africa was given to the Pope as slaves, all the people of Africa to Portugal. Yeah, and then all of Americas was given to, Columbus. And then, the Portuguese wanted a piece of it, so they divided it up between Portugal and a straight line. And so that's how the caste system got started. It originated in Holy Roman Empire, papal bulls.
There's one more question, I think.
It's so
I want
important.
to
Do you mind? Yeah, it's so important.
Yes.
Juan has asked you, he says, oh, this is really, I'm so glad. Thank you, Juan, for this. I'm in Texas, he says, and I teach middle school. I use your young reader to teach impact of European contact with the Americas. In Texas, Roxanne, your book is on a list of CRT books not to be taught. How
Right.
do educators proceed in continuing to teach this topic?
Right. It's on a lot of the lists, but I think that was the first one, and it's the young people's version that poor Debbie and Jean got blocked. But I think it really boomerangs, because there's nothing that makes kids more curious than something that is denied them. So enough of those books are around, and librarians are definitely finding a way to resist this. I'm certain, because I know librarians. Actually, George W. Bush, tried to put a hold on librarians, if you remember, back in 2003 or so, and it didn't work out. So
His wife was a librarian.
Yeah. Yeah, his wife was a librarian.
And she's the founder of the Texas Book Fair. I think that there should be some organization. I'm going to be at the Texas Book Fair, Juan. I'm going to bring this point up because Christine Granados in Fredericksburg, Texas, is having problems with some very organized Christians who are banning books. And so she reached out to me. I haven't responded, Juan, but it's something that we need to talk about. We need to open our hocicos, talk about it, and rally, especially librarians. And Christine Granados is a great writer, undervalued because people don't know she's a great writer. So I always mention her. If you haven't read her, please read her books. But she lives in Fredericksburg, and she's one of my favorite Texas writers. She wrote a book called Fight Like a Man, or Saints and Sinners from El Chuco. And she's asking me that question. So we need to, organize ourselves. We need to align ourselves with the librarians. If it wasn't for librarians, I would not be an author. So I think that's, we have to organize, just like the people that want to ban. And I hope that we meet, Juan, because I loved your question.
Yes, thank you, Juan.
That was really, okay. I don't know, I kind of can't resist just this last question. What about, Esther Hernandez asks you, what about all the children, mostly indigenous, imprisoned at the border?
Yes, please talk about that. That was one of my questions. And
I really think we have to talk about this.
I know. I have a lot in that book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, about the children at the border, because it was happening, right when I was writing the book. It had, of course, happened before under Obama in 2014. There was that wave, also children at the border that people kind of forgotten, but it was far more dense. I mean, the situation had gotten so bad in Honduras and in El Salvador, and for different reasons. But But the children, sending the children is an act of desperation, that is, I thought even, during the pandemic, that there was a lot of pushback, a lot of support, that people really opposed it, but especially when Trump first came in and made all the new rules, and of course they just now got lifted. It's still continued for the last year and a half, and how much misery. So it's children locked up in cages and in horrible detention centers. I was thinking, they set up those tents and detention centers that is like putting a flashing green light for all predators from anywhere. Come and work here, because they were just hiring anyone who came because they didn't have enough staff, without background checks or anything. And I'm sure there were so many abuses to these children that will follow them throughout their life, not just a one-time thing, but something that is destructive. And it really weighs on me, when I think about it. Just the multiplication, and that some of them are still, lost. They still haven't found. Right. Hundreds, rematched hundreds of these children with their parents.
They kept no records, right? When they separated the families, they didn't keep records.
They didn't keep records. No. No, it's a travesty. It's just horrible.
America's painful.
Yeah.
I think we ran out of time, but I want to say something before Judith closes and drops the curtain. So please, I'm just bursting to say, Roxanne, born in San Antonio, that makes you eligible for Texas Institute of Letters. If you aren't already, they nominate you. You also can apply for the Dobie Paisano Fellowship. You have to be born in Texas to apply for that. And that's a 6 months residency. And finally, the last thing I want to say is every year I'm invited to do a panel at the San Antonio Book Fair, and it's called Sandra Cisneros Presents. Ooh. And I'm going to invite you for next year. It's too late for this year to be on my panel, and then we can continue this wonderful conversation. And I'm going to claim you for Texas. Why? Because Texas needs you right now. It's a very hard time. There's all kinds of book banning. There's all kinds of horrible things happening. I was just there. It feels so violent. And now I understand reading your book why. So please, please, please know that you have a Texas ally, and we're going to get you there.
Well, it's very personal to me because one of my best and oldest friends, her son is he actually ran for Congress, Mike Siegel. He and his wife's daughter, my friend's granddaughter, is trans girl, and 9 years old. And how this will, just having that personal connection with these laws that are being passed that will make this child illegal, literally illegal, the existence of her. So I'm really just I would, anything I can do. Let me know.
There's a reason why you were born in San Antonio, so I'm going to bring you back.
Yeah, good.
I love that. I mean, if that's one thing that came out of this, boy, that would, because Abbott's kind of slated for the #1 position for running for president, but yeah, we need you in Texas.
Good.
Actually, we need you everywhere, because this way of understanding the true history is really everything for all of us as activists, that we have some sort of foundation of really the complexity which we're never taught. We were never taught of the real truth of where all of us live.
Well, I say turn it back to Mexico and it'll change pretty quickly.
What I say.
California too.
Mexico, Roxanne. So that I'd want to bring you back to have the whole New Mexico conversation, right, Sandra?
Yes, yes.
We'll get
And there's a
Levi.
lot of material about New Mexico in your book too that was splendid that we didn't get a chance to even touch on.
Yeah, we could talk for hours. Thank you all so much. And
Hours.
thank
This was
You.
everyone who was
you.
here.
I've got to tell you, you have so much love. Both. Oh, there are you. Look, there you.
Yes, Maui. Yes, we say
Oh,
goodbye and thank you. She's been quietly sitting on my lap this whole time.
Oh, I
Thank
love
you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
I got to
you.
tell you, you guys, the love and praise and depth of the comments
Oh, thank
is
you.
pouring in, thanking you and thanking you both. And just basically, here's the word: you guys are treasures. You're treasures. We
Oh,
recognize it. And we're so incredibly grateful to you for your books, for your thinking, for this conversation, for your time, and for all the work you've done over your lives.
thank you.
There's nothing more important right now than all the
People
people.
have questions that they didn't get to ask today. How should they contact our guests?
You know, they can Google me and my email is there. I know because people write me all the time that I don't know. And I Googled and I found, oh, there's the first thing, my email. It's rdunbaro at pacbell, PACBELL.net.
Okay, spell it again. I'm going to put it in the chat, please.
R Dunbar, RDUNBARO at pacbell, PACBELL.net.
Got it. And
Do write
y'all,
me.
yes, please feel completely welcome. Roxanne is offered to answer your questions. And I'm going to say that it is a political act of unstinting beauty to buy books. And that
Yes.
returns the gift. That returns the gift. So I have just put into the chat the Beacon Press website where you can learn about and buy Roxanne's books. And I have put sandracisneros.com/books so you can know where to get Sandra's books as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, you guys. And I just want to close tonight by saying, you all know that San Miguel Pen is the little center that can. And we vigorously champion writers' rights and freedom of expression all over the world. We're excited by what we've done so far, and we are not done. Our work is more necessary than ever, and we encourage you to get active. If you're a member, come join us. Come work with us. And if you're not a member, come join our center. And I'm going to put our website and my email in the chat. And I want to thank you all, everyone here tonight, for caring about our world, for caring about our future, and for showing up for such a delicious and amazing event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Adios, adios, gracias, hasta luego.
Thanks so much. And thanks to Penn. I'm a member.